Educational Communications and this station present Environmental Directions with Nancy Pearlman. On this series, we explore the effects of human influence on the Earth's ecosystems and discuss solutions to environmental problems which affect the quality of life on this planet. Environmental Directions gives you the kind of information you need to help you participate in decisions impacting your community, the nation, and the world. Now, here's your host, Nancy Pearlman.
Hello. For the next half hour, we are going to be talking about making our streets safe with my guest, Ben Wolf. He is a documentary filmmaker and cinematographer. He is director of a new documentary called Changing Lanes, which premiered at the Architecture and Design Film Festival. Welcome. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thanks for having me, Nancy.
I thoroughly enjoyed your film about city streets, and you focused on one in particular in Brooklyn, New York. But before we delve into what is going on there, let's talk about the history of city streets, because obviously they were created in an era of pedestrians, horses, streetcars, taken over by cars, and now cars seem to dominate, but aren't streets for everybody, whether or not they're on foot, on bicycle, in a car?
That is the big question. Funny thing about streets is, I think like a lot of things in human experience, what we grow up with, we just assume it's always been that way. I grew up in Los Angeles, although I live in New York now, and the streets I knew were completely for cars. You may or may not have a small sidewalk on the sides for walking, but that was sort of the assumption, and that seems to be, people just think that's sort of a natural law, that's what streets are. And so I thought that talking about history is important because people should understand that streets have served a variety of different purposes in history. As you noted, I mean, obviously they've been around for thousands of years, actually, for long before the car. And for a variety of reasons, in America in particular, although largely in cities worldwide, we've allowed the cars to completely take over.
We know that streets move people, move vehicles, but you showed a few interesting historical pictures in your film about how streets were really an active marketplace, an active place to socialize, where it wasn't just a city plaza, but the streets had people doing business on them, selling things, connecting, playing in them.
All of the above. I think that's what makes a city different than, in the countryside. Sure, a street is simply a way to get from one farm or town to another, but to the extent that cities are places where people congregate and come together, the street has a very different function, or at least I think arguably should have a very different function in a city, because that's sort of the whole point of a city, is a place where people interact spontaneously. That's very hard to do when we've let the public spaces be completely taken over by people in metal boxes moving very quickly.
We noticed here in Los Angeles a difference in street use during COVID, because restaurants were not allowed to have people inside, and so they took over some parking spaces and basically put outdoor eateries where cars used to be. A few still remain, but that's changing again, isn't it?
Yeah, the same thing happened in New York, and there's been a sort of fight ever since between the people that would like to see that continue and the other folks who want just, again, all of the space for the cars. I will say one big difference between Los Angeles, where I grew up, and New York, where I've lived now for about 30-ish years, is in New York, most people don't have cars. And even if they do, they generally aren't using them to get around the city. So here, the fact that we've given up all the space to cars is particularly peculiar, since that's not the way most people are getting around. It's a sort of a special case. And then that's a bit unusual in America. LA is more like, I think, the rest of the country, where cars are the main form of transportation.
It's a problem here in Los Angeles where the cars overtook the red line, as we called the mass transit system, not buses, but a rail line. And now we're trying to reestablish a metro system, and a lot of people didn't like it because it was taking up some street space for cars.
Yeah.
How do you resolve that?
Well, this is maybe the biggest question my movie, I don't think it answers, but it at least poses some questions about how does change happen at all. One thing I've learned a lot in making it is there's just a huge resistance to change, period. Things like streets are very personal to people. They're sort of the world that people grew up in. And when they see that change, they get upset. That's sort of the default position. Whether or not the change will actually be beneficial is sort of secondary to just people being very, I would say, suspicious and generally sort of glass half empty when it comes to any change. And this is also why I thought the history is so important, because I think, again, people have this assumption that the way it is now is sort of optimal or the best and it shouldn't change. And it's like, well, no, if you look at history, you see streets have changed a lot over time. And I don't think there's a good reason to assume that the way it is right now is particularly beneficial. And there's lots and lots of reasons, be it injuries and deaths or pollution or just the general pleasantness of being in a city. There's lots of reasons to say, no, this could be better. I'll add, I'm somebody that travels a lot for my job, which again is mostly cinematography on other folks' movies, and I see what cities around the world are like. And there's a reason why Americans love going to Barcelona and Copenhagen and Paris, and a lot of it has to do with the way the streets are and the sort of the joy of walking around and sort of experiencing the place on foot, on streets, in plazas. And when we give up all of our space to cars, we lose that.
Some areas in Europe that are doing a good job with making streets safe and pleasant for everyone. Europe does seem to be taking a lead on that, and I've seen it myself. However, I've also traveled to Africa, I've traveled to Asia, and the traffic is really something else in some of the Asian cities. Between the traffic, not just cars, and little tuk-tuk, a motorized tricycle, and people on scooters and mopeds. I found when I was in Saigon, I couldn't even cross the street because of all the mopeds and scooters. It was so dangerous. It was worse than in Los Angeles with the cars. There's also in India, you'd have the cows walking along in the road, people doing things, even living on the street. How do these poorer countries, how do these other countries adopt some of the good practices and change what is going on, just as we need to make some of those changes in the United States?
Yeah, that question's probably above my pay grade. I've also been to many of these places. I had maybe the scariest drive of my life in Mumbai, just speeding through or outside of Mumbai. People everywhere and congestion and 5 people on a moped. It's extreme. And there's also some ironies, like China used to be a place where everybody got around on bicycles, and then when they reached a certain level of affluence, they sort of repeated all the mistakes we did, and everybody's got in a car, and now those places are horribly polluted and congested with cars. So I don't want to say that we're the worst. I think there are probably places that are worse or are repeating the same mistakes we made. I do know that Janette Sadik-Khan, who is sort of a hero in my movie, who again ran the transportation department under Bloomberg, she now consults internationally with cities around the world. I know she's done a lot of work like in Mexico City. I do think there are lessons that can be applied, but that's probably another movie.
What would you present in a future documentary to develop this issue even more? Would you cover many cities? Would you take other streets in your neighborhood? What would you do differently? What do you wish you had been able to do?
It's interesting. I'm quite, and this is rare, but I'm quite happy with the documentary that I made. There's not much that I regret about it. I think I was incredibly lucky to kind of stumble onto a story that unfolded in such an interesting way, and a way also that ultimately is positive. Most of the time I was making this movie, I was not expecting a good outcome. So when things, and again, without giving away everything that happens in the movie, but when things resolve in the way they do, it was a very pleasant surprise. So I feel like it's a very nice story with a nice beginning, middle, and end, and I think it works.
It definitely works.
That's good. And I know, having gone to lots of screenings now, I can sense that audiences are engaged and emotionally moved, and that's great, because I think a movie like this should, one of the things you want to do in a movie like this is inspire people, and I think it does that.
The film is inspiring.
It's very good to hear. I don't think I want to do another movie that's too similar, because I think it is a microcosm, but I think it's a microcosm for a lot of similar streets, so I don't think I need to tell the same story in a bunch of different places. I am fascinated with bigger questions about sort of politics and what it takes to change things, and so I'm likely to find something, a different topic, but that also relates to those sort of questions.
I look forward to seeing your new documentaries on many other issues, because there are so many to make our cities livable, sustainable, protect our environment. There are many, many stories for you to tell.
Absolutely.
Occasionally here in Southern California, some cities are taking a couple of blocks and realizing that if they get rid of the car, close it all off to vehicles and make it more like a park and have booze and other entertainment in the street, that it brings in people. People want to congregate. City of Santa Monica on the beach turned a few blocks into the 3rd Street Promenade. I went to school in Westwood, going to UCLA, and always wondered why the Village, as we called it, didn't have some blocks not allowing cars so that we could all congregate in the street, and they finally did it for one block. It seems like more of that is necessary.
I think so. It depends what you mean by necessary, but I think it generally makes places more fun and pleasant. And ironically, one of the biggest opposing groups to these changes tends to be local businesses. And the irony is that if we look at streets where these changes are made, the local businesses generally benefit. Because again, shoppers are not shopping from their car. They're shopping, usually they're walking down the street and they stop into a store. So just people want to hang out in the space. It's a pleasant place. When a street just becomes choked with traffic, that's not an appealing place to spend time.
In your film, Changing Lanes, you presented many different options. You focused on one street in particular, but before we talk about that, quote, battle to make that street safer in Brooklyn, New York, let's talk about what you mentioned in travels in other parts of the world. You had some footage of people in places like the Netherlands, where not only did they have dedicated bicycle lanes, but they had sidewalks, bicycle lanes, all separate, segregated from the cars so that they were safe to use.
That's right. And we see that in parts of New York now, and a lot of those ideas are sort of imported from Western Europe. The thing that makes cycling dangerous, and it often is portrayed as a dangerous activity in our culture, is interactions with cars. If you can separate out bikes from cars, then cycling is an accident is going to mean a scraped knee. It's not a fatality. Most of the solutions to these problems involves separating out, giving pedestrians a space, giving bikes a space, giving cars a space. The more you mix them and have things going at very different speeds, also with problems of visibility with big, huge cars now where it's hard to even see over the hood, that's what leads to serious injury.
You focused in your film on one street and how the residents actually wanted a change because there were regular, quote, accidents, and as you say, accidents aren't really accidents, but a result of design and culture, and they wanted to make a street safe by removing some lanes for cars, and of course people in the cars wanted to keep those lanes, and you also pointed out that adding additional lanes doesn't necessarily make streets safer or improve traffic.
All correct. The name of the particular street that the film focused on is McGinnis Boulevard, and it's in the Greenpoint neighborhood of Brooklyn. I actually live about 5 miles away in another neighborhood, but it's not far from where I live. And it's historically been one of the more dangerous streets in the city. It was created by Robert Moses from the present urban planning perspective, did a lot of harmful things to the city. He took what had been a very small residential street called Oakland Street and made it from being, I believe it was 2 lanes wide and cobblestone, and he turned it into a 4-lane street by knocking down 500 houses, which was something like a highway, really, through a residential community. And that's almost by definition how you end up with danger. When you narrow small streets, you won't have speeding traffic. You'll have careful traffic because it's not a particularly fast way to get from point A to point B. But once you open something up like that, you're inviting cars to move very quickly. And from the beginning, it's been dangerous. 70 years ago, there have been, depending on the estimate, I've heard one estimate is perhaps as many as 200 deaths from crashes on McGinnis Boulevard over the decades. The particular story I followed kicked off in 2021 when the last fatality happened, which was a local elementary school teacher who was just crossing the street on his birthday and got hit by a car because he was such a beloved figure, and also because, to some extent, because the community has become more, for lack of a better word, gentrified. So you have people that are, I think, more engaged and more connected. It really set enough people who were serious enough and empowered enough to try to do something, to start applying pressure to make something happen.
As someone who has worked in Los Angeles to try and make our streets safe, to try and create bicycle lanes, I learned learned a lot in watching your film about this particular activism by the residents to change something so that people weren't getting killed, to make the street livable and enjoyable again.
Yeah.
It really requires leadership, activism, and the residents were willing to gather together to try and get a plan to make some of the changes, and yet one of the major landowners on the McGinnis Boulevard was basically giving money to elected officials to not accept the proposal that the residents wanted. Can you explain that?
Yeah, and I also don't want to give away all the twists
you want people to watch the film.
I do. But I will say this was a years-long struggle. It was literally something like 4 or 5 years between this teacher getting killed and the sort of implementation of real changes on the street. That's how long it took. So that's the amount of work that was involved. And again, this is only a sort of a case study in change, and every place is different. But in this place, you had very strong, well-organized activist group in the community. You also then had, as you indicated, a sort of another group that arose that was organized against the changes and largely financed by some business people. And it just wasn't clear how this was going to play out. And I didn't know as I was making it how it was going to play out. I think one thing that I learned that's a bit discouraging is that the system doesn't seem to be very rational, I would say, and in the sense that you have traffic engineers in the Department of Transportation who studied that street, came up with a plan, very much driven by just data. There are people that actually know what they're talking about and study these things. And yet that plan came extremely close to not being implemented because of sort of the backdealing that was happening in a fairly corrupt under the previous mayor. And if you look at the history of the city, which my movie sort of tries to gradually go into, things move by sort of fits and starts, and sometimes there's progress and sometimes things slide backwards. I wish it were a much clearer, if I really could believe that we were really just moving towards better streets. I think at times we have. The movie kind of celebrates under the Bloomberg era, which was over a decade ago, where you had a really strong Department of Transportation under a really strong commissioner, Janette Sadik-Khan, who had the full support of the mayor, and they just said, to heck with the people that are going to complain, we're going to put these things in and see how they go. And it takes real leadership like that, and that kind of leadership is fairly rare, unfortunately.
The story is so complex, and we're going to talk more about making our streets safe and the example in Brooklyn, New York of what citizens did when we return in a moment with my guest, Ben Wolf, documentary filmmaker, director of Changing Lanes.
Environmental Directions with Nancy Pearlman continues with further discussion of the world's critical ecological issues. For more information, you may call 310-559-9160 or go to www.ecoprojects.org. Now, here's Nancy.
I'm speaking with Ben Wolf, who is a cinematographer, documentary filmmaker, director of the new documentary Changing Lanes. As someone who coordinated the first Earth Day in Southern California in 1970, I organized about 1,000 bicyclists along Wilshire Boulevard to try and get bike lanes and talk about making our streets safe and not just for cars. And we didn't get a permit because bicycles are considered vehicles. We stopped at the red lights. It wasn't like a parade or a illegal rally. And yet, in all these decades, so few bike lanes have been added in Los Angeles, and every time one is proposed, there's still opposition by the car people who say, no, they don't want to take out a lane. And yet you point out that the street design is often counterintuitive because adding vehicle lanes generally doesn't reduce traffic, and taking away lanes doesn't increase it. We've seen this with our freeways. When they add a lane, they're still bumper to bumper at times.
That is absolutely correct. And I guess that's one of my main motivations in making a movie like this, is I do think there's a lot about street design that is counterintuitive. Seems obvious. So if traffic's bad, we should have wider streets. Well, what's obvious there is wrong. Any number of set studies and streets will show that basically when you make a street wider, you're effectively inviting more cars to use that street, and then you end up generally with more or less the same level of traffic, but just more of it. I think it's very important to try to get some of this less intuitive information out there for the public. If we're going to work as a democracy, then people that are voting have to have some basic understanding of the issues. And unfortunately, this is an area where I think people generally don't have a very good idea. I would add that I think part of the reason that, and this is sort of my theory about what's happened, I think part of the reason we've ended up where we do is that industry, car industry, oil industry, steel industry, all of these are very potent political groups. And I think they've controlled the agenda in many ways. And that might sound conspiratorial, but I don't mean it that way so much as politicians, they're going to serve people that can get them elected. And often that's been these industrial groups, commercial groups. And it's often not sort of the big mass of pedestrians out there or walkers or whatever have a lot less potency politically generally, unless they get really organized, which doesn't happen every day.
Another aspect of streets, at least here in Los Angeles, is not just moving the vehicles, but where to park them.
Yes.
And parking has become a major problem because the city is not building parking structures. Old office buildings, old stores don't have parking spaces. We need to really talk about streets in the context of transportation and mass transit. Yet while we do have some bus service, I take the bus, I take the metro when I can, but I have to drive to it to take the metro. And where do I park? The problem seems to be getting worse because they're now building new condominiums and apartment houses near metro stations as though everybody's going to always take the metro who lives in those, and they're not having parking, which only means that the streets are going to be congested even more with cars parked on them. So we really have to look at this in a bigger context of how do we transport people and where does that transportation end up when we're not in the vehicles?
Absolutely. And LA, again, is one of the more car-dominated cities, and making these kind of changes there are very difficult because you're sort of starting from nothing. At least in New York, we do have a pretty good subway system, a pretty good buses. We do have a sort of half-built network of bike lanes that hopefully under the new mayor will start to be filled out more. I believe, I might not be quite right on this, but something like half the land in the city of LA is basically parking lots and streets. The amount of space is insane. I wanted to add that this is also the fundamental problem with automobiles and cities, and I have a car that I use primarily for work when I need to move equipment around the city. But the truth is that cars were never going to be the ideal solution for getting around the city. There's just too many people in too little space, and if everybody has a car, there's just no way that that's going to work efficiently. You're going to end up with gridlock, and you're also going to end up just giving half of the space in the city to just store these things, which is what LA has done, instead of housing people or any number of things that could be done with that space that would be probably preferable. And so things like transit and bicycles most of the time are a much more better solution for transportation when it comes to sort of dense cities. Again, that wouldn't be true in the countryside, but in a city, it's a very specific situation.
Even though I have been fighting for safe streets and bicycle lanes and sidewalks and alternative transportation, I still found it fascinating to see your documentary because it focused on a particular street, McGinnis Boulevard in Brooklyn, New York, and the struggle of the citizens to redesign this notoriously dangerous street. And I learned new things, even though I know the issue. Your film is really a microcosm to examine the larger topics, including the history and safety of our streets and the counterintuitive art of street design and the resistance to change and the dysfunction of our political system. You really covered a lot. I want people to see your film. How do they do so?
Okay. It's still traveling just various film festivals and sort of screenings at colleges and such. The official commercial theatrical release will be in Los Angeles at 4 Laemmle theaters. At some point later in the year, probably around the middle of the year, we'll be streaming on one of the big platforms. I will keep updated information about screenings and the streaming and whatnot on the website for the film, which is Changing Lanes Doc, like documentary, DOC, changinglanesdoc.com. So look there if they're interested in seeing the film.
And that is spelled CHANGINGLANES doc.com.
Right.
And they can reach out to you to find out more information about Changing Lanes, the documentary. How long did it take you to do the film Changing Lanes? How many months, years? How much footage did you shoot? How long is the film and how much outtake footage is there? And are you going to be making another film using that?
Right. So the film is about 75 minutes. I probably shot about 100 hours, which that might sound like a lot for a 75-minute film, but I think for a documentary, that's a fairly typical thing. It's the challenge and also the excitement of doing a documentary is when you're following unfolding events, you just don't know what's going to happen, so you need to shoot a lot, and you kind of find it as you go. I'm not planning on using the footage I have as a whole for another big project, although little bits of it I've helped out various people to whom it was useful. I shot for about 3 years, which also may sound like a long time, but in documentary that's a fairly probably normal amount of time to shoot. So that's sort of how long it took to make this film.
Is everyone cooperative, or did you have some people not wanting to be in the film?
By and large, people were cooperative, especially on the part of the people that were opposed to these changes on the street. There tended to be a more paranoid outlook. I would be asked, who are you working for? Who are you shooting? What side are you on? And I would try to say, I'm just making a documentary. I'm not on the side per se. I'm trying to tell the story of what's happening here. So I do think that sort of paranoia goes with a certain mindset that's resistant to change, a suspicion that anything that anybody's doing is going to be bad. It was interesting also, the sort of activist community was very happy to engage with me and to tell me their thoughts and what they wanted and what they had found from the research. The people that were against it were pretty resistant to interacting. Again, the sort of suspiciousness, and I think ultimately when we find out at the end of the film about some corruption, I think they also know that they didn't want to be completely honest about what was really going on.
When we say let's have safe streets, what does that really mean?
Probably different people would offer different definitions. To me, there's objective just data. You can find out, I think every municipality keeps this information about how many crashes are happening in a certain place. To me, the ideal is a place where the street can be used by everyone who wants to use it in whatever way they want to use it. So I think to me, the sort of gold standard is a street that's beautiful to walk on, beautiful to bike on, convenient to drive when that's the preferred way. And I think a really well-designed street can serve all of those purposes. A street that's only serving one group, to me, is sort of out of balance. In a sort of democracy, we should try to make things that reasonable compromises between all the different things that people would like to do. It's sort of, to me, the democratic ideal is let's figure out the best compromise that makes this work for everyone.
What new films are you going to be pursuing that they can learn about?
I haven't quite figured it out yet. It's an exciting time. I think I was fortunate to find a subject. This is a subject that in history kind of comes and goes, but I think right now we're at a moment where we've taken cars about as far as they can go in a world where we're having problems with energy and warming and general expense, and people want to live in cities but can't sort of figure out how to do that. And there's all kinds of reasons why I think the sort of status quo is really ready for a change.
You focused on McGinnis Boulevard in Brooklyn, New York, because you live in the area. You know about the problem. You have heard about possible solutions. But how many other cities, streets are there where citizens are trying to make the streets safer? How many safe streets exist in the United States?
Yeah, I don't have the answer. I know a lot about New York, and I would say it's sort of dangerous as McGinnis is, it's not the most dangerous. There are probably a dozen similar streets in the city that really need to be changed first, just as a matter of safety, which I do think has to be the number one priority. After you sort of address the most dangerous places, you can think, okay, what would also be just nice from the point of view of business or leisure or whatever, or sort of filling out a whole transit system like for bikes so that you knew you could get from any point in the city to any other part of the city safely, which you really can't right now. There are areas where there's very good infrastructure in New York City, and there are areas where there isn't. And again, New York City, I realize, is an outlier in the state. They've implemented the most of these sort of street calming, traffic calming projects as probably any city in the states that I'm aware of.
Does any street or city in the United States stand out to you? I know Davis, California, Boulder, Colorado have been well known for having bicycle lanes.
I think it's true of a lot of small cities. I think a lot of small cities have been able to do things, but it's a bit of a different animal. It's the real thing that fascinates me is the challenge of doing these kind of changes to large cities. I was in Barcelona a few months ago, and that is a large city that is just a pleasure. I mean, again, again, there's a reason why people love to go there. Barcelona is among those European cities where I believe that their per capita injuries and death on the streets is about a quarter of what we have in America. So that we're talking way safer, not just marginally safer, like tremendously safer, like hundreds of fewer people getting killed, thousands of less people getting injured every year, and just much more pleasant. Like it is these are destination cities because people love to go there and walk around and spend their money. So businesses should love that too. To me, the comparisons are more generally to cities outside of the States, because that's where I see places that are really doing it right at scale. Paris is looked at a lot recently as a city that, a big city, that really made big changes in a fairly short amount of time under their mayor, Anne Hidalgo, who I believe is just finishing her time there.
I am so pleased that you have explored this issue and presented an example of what's going on, what can be done in your film, Changing Lanes. Thank you so very much for making this documentary. Thank you for being my guest.
It's really my pleasure. Thanks so much.
You're welcome. I have been speaking with Ben Wolf, who is a cinematographer and documentary filmmaker. I'm Nancy Pearlman. Thank you very much for joining us, and do tune in again next week.
If you would like free information about these environmental issues, go to www.ecoprojects.org or call 310-559-9160. Environmental Directions with your host, Nancy Pearlman, is a community affairs program of the nonprofit organization Educational Communications and this station.